This video covers Chapter 9 of Price Analysis, a fundamental approach to the study of commodity prices. We're going to talk about some strategies we might use to go about forecasting the use categories in the USDA-WASDE balance sheets. Recall we had two domestic categories, food, seed, and industrial, that included the category for ethanol production, and feed and residual. And then in addition to those two domestic categories, we had a category just related to exports. If we're going to think about forecasting these use categories, a first step is going to be to look at what have the recent trends looked like in these use categories. So here you can see Figure 1 is the use category for corn for the food, alcohol, and industrial use category, and the data is presented here quarterly. These data come from the feed grain database that's maintained by the USDA Economic Research Service. And the striking feature about this graph is the market uptrend that happens around the year of 2005. There was a slight trend upward in that category prior to that, but in 2005 we passed the Renewable Fuels Standard, which required blenders of retail gasoline to include ethanol into those blends, up to a maximum of 10% of our retail gasoline supply, which is roughly 15 billion gallons. So you can see over the years from 2005 to 2010, we were ramping up to that level, and we've been pretty flat on ethanol production since around that time, and that's why you see this category sort of start to plateau around that time. Also noteworthy in this graph is the market pullback related to the 2012 drought. The drought caused prices to climb, which made all use categories restrict or ration their demand. We know from previous work that production has been trending upward primarily through the effects of increases in trend yields. Therefore, if we want to assess whether use has been shifting from one category to another, it's useful to take a look at these categories as a percent of production, and that's what's displayed here in Figure 3. So you can see that as we look back to the early 1990s and then look forward through 2016 and look at annual use data, we see that through those years when we were ramping up ethanol production, we have indeed saw that use was shifting towards the food, alcohol, and industrial use category. So even as total production has been trending upward over this time, we've saw even stronger demand from this category for ethanol production, and we've seen that even with these increases in total production, we've had to shift an allocation in these use categories towards this category. Next, let's take a look at the recent trend in the exports category. You can see that this trend line appears to be fairly flat in levels, and there appears to be a pretty strong seasonal pattern. If you line these things up by quarter, you'll see that exports are largest in the second quarter of the marketing year, which is December through February. And that makes sense because it's right after we harvest a new crop, and typically we will put in seasonally low prices right after the harvest. If you compare Figure 4 to Figure 5, you can see that seasonality smoothed away when we take a look at the annual chart, and then you see the broader trend as we look at the Figure 5. So there we see that exports have been fairly flat over this time frame. That's in contrast to what we saw in the food, alcohol, and industrial category. The one exception there being, again, the drought from 2012, clearly visible as exports were pulled back in response to high prices that year. Just to preview what comes later, we can see from this that the export category is generally regarded to be the most sensitive to prices among all of the other categories. And that should make some sense because countries who are importing U.S. corn have alternative sources that they can go to. And when we have a short crop in the United States, and maybe they're not having a short crop in other places, and the high prices in the U.S. will cause them to maybe be able to find grain more cheaply in other places. So that's particularly why we see the export category being the most responsive to prices, and you definitely see that reflected here in Figure 5. Now let's take a look at Figure 5 and Figure 6 together. Figure 5 was presented with annual data, and we saw that that is pretty much flat over time. Now when we do this calculation as a percent of production, we see that although we are exporting a relatively constant amount of corn to other countries, the percent of production is actually falling. And when we were talking about the category that includes ethanol use before, that should be obvious that it's going to have to come from somewhere. If we're increasing the percent of our production that we're putting towards the production of ethanol, then that's going to have to be substituted away from somewhere. And in this case, as a percent of production, we are shifting away from exports in corn and shifting towards the production of ethanol as a percent of the total crop. Now the flat line on the annual chart means that our trading partners are asking for just as much corn as they ever were. It's just not trending up and keeping pace with the increases we have in supply that we see year over year. Again, primarily due to the fact that yields are trending upward at nearly 2 bushels per year on average. Speaking of exports, let's take a look here in Table 1 of our top 12 importers of U.S. corn from marketing years 2012 through 2016. Remember, the 2016-2017 marketing year is the one that we harvested last fall in 2016 and just completed in August of 2017. So we can see here that the largest importers of U.S. corn go to Mexico and Japan, respectively, and they're fairly close in the amounts that they are importing from the U.S. A distant third is South Korea, and then other countries falling in behind there. One thing we'll see when we take a look at forecasting use of soybeans is that exports are a much more important factor in soybean markets than they are in corn markets. Recall, in the corn market, we are exporting between 10 and 15% of the crop. That number is much higher in the soybean market, which we'll see very shortly.